The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, and by the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. After 37 years of peaceful mornings on my family's ranch, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and amber, I was being told that I no longer had the right to access my own property. According to the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, I was trespassing on land that had belonged to my family for 4 generations. But Karen Hendricks, the HOA president who signed that letter, had no idea what she'd just awakened. Because while she thought she held all the cards, I was about to discover something that would turn her perfectly planned subdivision into the biggest legal nightmare of her life. My name is Robert Chen, and I've lived on the same 1,000-acre ranch in northern Montana my entire life. I inherited the ranch when my father passed away 5 years ago. Dad had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and in those final months, we spent countless hours sitting on the old wooden dock he'd built when I was 12, talking about everything and nothing. He'd always told me the same thing, Bobby. This land isn't just our home. It's our legacy. Promise me you'll fight for it if you ever have to. I never imagined I'd need to. The trouble started about 3 years ago when I began noticing survey markers appearing along what I thought was my eastern property line. Bright orange flags tied to metal stakes, marching through the forest like soldiers. When I called the county office, they told me a development company called Mountain Vista Holdings had purchased adjacent land and was planning a residential subdivision. How adjacent? I asked the clerk. Right up to your property line, sir. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. I'd walked those boundaries with my father dozens of times growing up. I knew every tree, every rock formation, every bend in the creek that fed into our lake. And those survey markers? They were a good 50 yards inside what I'd always understood to be our land. I hired a surveyor, a gruff, methodical man named Pete Morrison, who'd been mapping land in our county for 30 years. Pete spent a week tramping through the forest with his equipment, and when he came to my door with his findings, his expression was grim. "Robert," he said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs where my father used to drink his morning coffee, "we've got a problem. According to the county records, your property line is exactly where those orange flags are marked." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. That's impossible, Pete. My dad showed me our boundaries 100 times. I know. And here's the thing, I surveyed this land for your father back in '98 when he was refinancing. My measurements then showed the property line running 50 yards east of where it's marked now. He pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. Someone's changed the official records. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the lake around midnight, something I'd done countless times when I needed to think. The water was still as glass, reflecting the stars like scattered diamonds. This place wasn't just my home, it was my sanctuary. The idea that someone might take even a piece of it felt like they were trying to steal my soul. Over the next 6 months, I watched Mountain Vista Holdings transform the disputed land into the beginning of what would become Willow Creek Estates. First came the bulldozers, tearing down century-old pines that I'd climbed as a boy. Then the road crews, laying fresh asphalt where deer paths used to wind through the underbrush. Finally, the foundation crews, pouring concrete for what the development signs promised would be luxury lakefront living. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were advertising lakefront property, but the lake they were referring to was mine. I tried to fight it through proper channels. I filed complaints with the county planning office. I hired a lawyer, a sharp young woman named Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in property disputes. But every door we tried to open seemed to slam shut. The county clerk insisted their records were accurate. Mountain Vista Holdings had teams of lawyers who buried us in paperwork and legal motions. "They're wearing us down," Sarah explained, during one particularly frustrating meeting. "It's a common tactic. They make fighting so expensive and time-consuming that most people just give up. But I wasn't most people. This was my family's land, and I'd made a promise to my father. The first residents moved into Willow Creek Estates 18 months ago. Young families mostly, drawn by the marketing promises of peaceful lakefront, living, and exclusive access to pristine recreational waters. I watched moving trucks wind down the new streets, carrying hope and furniture in equal measure. Part of me felt sorry for these people. They had no idea they were moving into what would become a war zone. The HOA formed immediately, as they always do in these planned communities. And, like moths to a flame, it attracted exactly the kind of person you'd expect, Karen Hendricks, a recently divorced real estate agent in her early 50s who saw the HOA presidency as her chance to build a little kingdom where she could make all the rules. Karen was the type of woman who measured her self-worth by how much control she could exert over others. She had perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer clothes that looked like they came straight from a catalog, and the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Within 3 months of moving in, she'd been elected HOA president by promising to maintain property values and ensure community standards. What she really meant was that she intended to make everyone's life miserable until they bent to her will. The harassment started small. Karen would drive her white BMW sedan slowly past my ranch entrance, sometimes stopping to take pictures. When I'd wave, trying to be neighborly, she'd speed away without acknowledgement. Then came the complaints to the county about my unsightly property apparently. My weathered barn and well-worn fence posts didn't meet her aesthetic standards. But Karen's real goal became clear when she knocked on my door for the first time 6 months after moving in. It was a Saturday morning, and I was enjoying coffee on my front porch when I saw her BMW turning into my driveway. She climbed out, wearing a crisp white blouse and navy slacks, carrying a leather folder like she was heading to a business meeting. "Mr. Chen?" she called out, her voice carrying that artificially sweet tone that immediately put me on guard. "I'm Karen Hendricks, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I was wondering if we could have a chat." I invited her up to the porch, more out of curiosity than courtesy. She perched on the edge of one of my father's old wooden chairs, like she was afraid it might contaminate her clothing. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, opening her folder with theatrical precision. "The residents of Willow Creek Estates are concerned about lake access. When they purchased their homes, they were promised lakefront amenities, but we've discovered that the lake is entirely on private property." "That's right," I said. "It's my property." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, that presents a problem. These families invested their life savings in lakefront homes, and now they have no access to the lake that was promised to them." I took a sip of my coffee, studying her face. "Sounds like they have a problem with Mountain Vista Holdings, not with me." "Actually," Karen said, pulling a document from her folder, "we've done some research. It appears that when the original subdivision was platted, there was supposed to be a public easement providing lake access to all residents." She handed me the paper, a copy of some kind of development plan covered in lines, measurements, and legal descriptions that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. "I'm not seeing any easement here," I said, handing it back. Karen's perfectly applied lipstick stretched into what she probably thought was a winning smile. "Mr. Chen, I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone. The HOA is prepared to offer you a generous annual payment in exchange for lake access rights for our residents." "How generous?" $5,000 per year. I almost laughed. The lake was worth more than that in fishing rights alone, never mind the intrinsic value to my family. "Thanks, but I'm not interested." For just a moment, Karen's mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then the smile snapped back into place. "Well," she said, standing and smoothing down her slacks, "I hope you'll reconsider. It would be a shame if this had to become a legal matter." After she left, I called Sarah Mitchell to tell her about the conversation. Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. "Robert, that sounded like a threat. Document everything. Save every email, every letter, every interaction. Something tells me this is just the beginning." And she was right. Because 3 weeks later, I received that certified letter informing me that I was trespassing on my own land. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the realization that Karen Hendricks and her HOA had apparently found a way to legally steal a piece of my family's legacy, and I had no idea how they'd done it. The letter from the HOA wasn't just a polite request to stay off certain areas of my property. It was a formal legal notice, complete with survey maps, property descriptions, and a threat of prosecution if I continued to unlawfully access what they claimed was now HOA common property. According to Karen's documentation, a strip of land 50 yards wide running along the entire eastern shore of the lake, including my father's old dock, was no longer mine. Somehow, through some legal mechanism I couldn't understand, it had become property of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I spread the papers across my kitchen table and called Sarah Mitchell immediately. "This is impossible," I told her, my voice tight with frustration. "How can they just declare that part of my land belongs to them?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment as I read her the key passages from the letter. Finally, she spoke, and her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before. "Robert, this is more sophisticated than I expected. They're claiming there was a dedication of property rights that occurred during the original subdivision process, essentially saying that when Mountain Vista Holdings developed the adjacent land, your previous property owner agreed to dedicate lake access rights to any future development. But I am the property owner. My family has owned this land since 1923. I know. And that's what we're going to prove. But this is going to be more complicated than I initially thought. They've clearly done their homework, and they're using some very specific legal mechanisms that are going to require extensive research to untangle. The legal fees were already mounting, but that wasn't what worried me most. What kept me awake that night was the realization that I was fighting people who had more money, more lawyers, and apparently more knowledge of property law than I did. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I began to wonder if I was going to lose. The next morning, I woke up to find a chain-link fence being installed along what the HOA claimed was their new property line. A crew of 4 men in hard hats was systematically blocking my access to the lake, driving fence posts into ground where my father had taught me to fish, where I'd scattered his ashes just 2 years earlier. I walked down in my bathrobe and slippers, still carrying my morning coffee. "Excuse me," I called out to the foreman, a heavy-set man with graying temples. "What's going on here?" He looked up from his clipboard. "Installing a fence, sir. Property line demarcation for the Homeowners Association. This is my property." The foreman's expression grew uncomfortable. "Sir, I just install where they tell me to install. If you have a dispute, you'll need to take it up with whoever hired us." I watched them work for another hour, each fence post, feeling like a nail being driven into my heart. By noon, they'd completely cut off my access to the lake. The dock my father had built with his own hands was now on the other side of a chain-link fence with NOTRESP, ASSINGPR, IVATEEARPIA, YOFWILO, WCREI, EKES, TATHA, ASAUACs. That afternoon, Karen Hendricks sent another letter. This one was hand-delivered by a process server who looked genuinely apologetic as he handed me the envelope. "Mr. Chen," the letter began, "we regret that you have chosen to make this matter contentious. However, the Willow Creek Estates HOA has a legal obligation to protect the property rights of all residents. Effective immediately, any attempt to access the lake through HOA property will be considered criminal trespassing and will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But she wasn't finished. The letter continued, "Additionally, we have received numerous complaints from residents about the unsightly condition of your property, the noise from your farming equipment, and the potential environmental hazards posed by your livestock. We are filing formal complaints with the county regarding these violations of local zoning ordinances." I sat down heavily in my father's old armchair, feeling the weight of the situation crushing down on me. They weren't just trying to take my lake access, they were trying to make it impossible for me to continue living on my own land. Over the next few weeks, the harassment escalated in ways I could never have imagined. County inspectors showed up unannounced to investigate anonymous complaints about everything from my septic system to the height of my grass. The fire department was called to inspect my barn after someone reported suspicious smoke, which turned out to be morning mist rising from the lake. Animal control officers arrived to investigate reports of aggressive livestock, my 3 elderly horses, who spent most of their time sleeping in the pasture. Every inspection, every visit, every complaint generated paperwork and fees. The county was required to investigate each report, and even when they found no violations, I was still responsible for administrative costs. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Karen Hendricks was wielding the knife with surgical precision. But the psychological warfare was even worse than the bureaucratic harassment. HOA residents began walking their dogs along the fence line, letting their children play right up against my property boundary, making it clear that they felt entitled to be there. Some of them would point at my house and barn, talking loudly about how rural properties were bringing down their property values. The worst incident happened on a Thursday evening in early spring. I was sitting on my porch after dinner when I noticed smoke rising from the direction of the lake. Not morning mist, this time actual smoke. I jumped in my truck and drove as close to the fence as I could get, then climbed over the chain-link barrier to investigate. Someone had built a bonfire right on the shore, barely 10 feet from where my father's dock extended into the water. A group of teenagers from the subdivision were roasting marshmallows, their music echoing across the water, beer cans scattered across the ground. "Hey!" I called out as I approached them. "You can't have a fire here." A kid who couldn't have been more than 16 looked up at me with that particular brand of suburban entitlement that only comes from never being told no. "It's HOA property," he said. "We can do whatever we want." "This is a fire hazard," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm. "And you're underage drinking." That's when one of the girls pulled out her phone and started recording. "This old guy is harassing us," she announced to her camera. "He's like trespassing on our property and trying to tell us what to do." Within an hour, Karen Hendricks was at my door with a sheriff's deputy in tow. According to the teenager's story backed up by cell phone video, I had aggressively confronted a group of innocent kids and threatened them. The fact that they were drinking illegally and had built an unauthorized fire seemed to be irrelevant details. "Mr. Chen," the deputy said, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, "I need to ask you to stay on your side of the fence. If you have concerns about activities on HOA property, you need to report them through proper channels." "Deputy, that fire was a serious hazard. If it had spread..." "Sir, the fire department has already extinguished it and determined it was properly contained. But you cannot cross onto private property to address issues yourself." After they left, I stood on my porch, looking out at the lake that had been in my family for 4 generations, now blocked from view by chain-link fence and no trespassing signs. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt truly defeated. But that night, as I was going through my father's papers looking for anything that might help my legal case, I found something that changed everything. Hidden in an old manila envelope at the bottom of a filing cabinet was a property deed I'd never seen before, not for the ranch, but for a small cabin on the far side of the lake. And according to the deed, dated 1962, my grandfather hadn't just owned the ranch. He'd owned additional property on the north shore of the lake property that, if the legal description was accurate, included mineral and water rights for the entire lake. As I sat there at midnight, reading and rereading that faded document by lamplight, I began to realize that Karen Hendricks and her HOA had made a critical error. They'd assumed they were dealing with an unsophisticated rancher who didn't understand property law. They'd assumed wrong. The next morning, I called Sarah Mitchell before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. My hands were still trembling slightly as I held the old deed, afraid to believe what it might mean. "Sarah, I need you to meet me at the ranch as soon as possible. I found something in my father's papers that changes everything." She arrived 2 hours later, and I spread the 1962 deed across my kitchen table. Sarah put on her reading glasses and studied it carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Robert," she said finally, "if this document is legitimate, and I mean if it indicates that your grandfather purchased additional property that includes not just the cabin site, but water rights to the entire lake, what does that mean exactly?" Sarah looked up from the deed, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw something like excitement in her eyes. "It means that even if the HOA somehow has legitimate claims to shoreline access, they don't have rights to the water itself. And without water rights, shoreline access is legally meaningless." We spent the rest of the morning researching the property records at the county courthouse. The clerk who helped us, a woman named Margaret, who'd worked there for 23 years, remembered my grandfather. "Henry Chen was a smart man," she told us as she pulled dusty record books from storage. "Quiet, but smart. He came in here several times in the early 60s, asking questions about water rights and mineral rights. Most folks back then didn't think about those things, but your grandfather did." What Margaret found in those old records was extraordinary. Not only had my grandfather legally purchased the cabin property and its associated water rights, but he'd also filed additional claims for mineral rights that extended throughout the lake bottom. In 1962, for less than $300 in filing fees, he'd secured legal control over every drop of water in the lake and everything beneath it. Why didn't my father ever mention this? I asked Sarah as we drove back to the ranch. "Maybe he didn't fully understand what your grandfather had done," she suggested. "Property law was different back then, and a lot of these old filings were poorly documented. It's possible your father knew about the cabin, but didn't realize the extent of the water and mineral rights." That afternoon, we drove around the lake to find the cabin property. It took us nearly an hour of hiking through dense forest, following old survey markers and GPS coordinates, but we finally found it. The cabin itself was little more than a ruined walls partially collapsed, roof caved in, windows long since broken. But it was still standing, and more importantly, it was exactly where the deed said it should be. Sarah took dozens of photos while I walked through what had once been my grandfather's retreat, trying to imagine him here, quietly securing the legal foundations that would eventually save our family's ranch. This is why they built the subdivision where they did, I realized aloud. They knew they couldn't get lake access from the south side because of the terrain, so they built on the east side and assumed they could pressure me into giving them access rights. And they probably assumed that even if you fought them, you'd never be able to afford the kind of legal battle they could wage, Sarah added. They didn't count on your grandfather being 60 years ahead of them. Over the next few weeks, Sarah worked with a property law specialist to verify every detail of the 1962 deed and its associated filings. What they discovered was even better than we'd hoped. Not only were all the documents legitimate and properly filed, but there were additional protections we hadn't even known about. In 1968, my grandfather had applied for and received a conservation easement that permanently protected the lake from commercial development. In 1974, he'd filed water rights claims that gave our family legal priority over any other users. And in 1981, just 2 years before he died, he'd registered the property with the State Historical Society as a family heritage site, which provided additional legal protections. Robert, Sarah told me during one of our evening strategy sessions, your grandfather didn't just buy a cabin. He spent 20 years building a legal fortress around this lake. He must have seen development coming even back then and decided to make sure his family would always be protected. But the best discovery came last. While researching the original Mountain Vista Holdings development plans, Sarah found something that Karen Hendricks and her lawyers had apparently missed. The development company had never actually secured legal lake access rights. They'd simply assumed, apparently based on outdated survey maps, that the lake was public property. They sold all these people lakefront homes without actually having the legal right to provide lake access, Sarah explained. That means they've committed fraud against every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. What does that mean for Karen and the HOA? Sarah smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her in months. It means they're about to discover that their legal position isn't just weak, it's non-existent. Armed with this new information, we filed a comprehensive legal response to the HOA's claims. But rather than simply defending against their accusations, we went on the offensive. We filed suits for trespassing, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We demanded immediate removal of the fence and cessation of all harassment activities. And we formally notified both the HOA and Mountain Vista Holdings that they were in violation of our water rights and would need to cease all lake-related activities immediately. The response was swift and predictable. Karen Hendricks called an emergency HOA meeting, and I could hear the shouting from half a mile away. Apparently, the revelation that they had no legal lake access and that Mountain Vista Holdings had essentially defrauded them had not been well received by the residents. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. 3 days after we filed our legal response, she showed up at my door again. This time, she wasn't alone. She'd brought 2 other HOA board members, a thin, nervous man named Gerald, who kept adjusting his glasses, and a woman named Patricia, whose permanent scowl suggested she was used to getting her way through intimidation. "Mr. Chen," Karen said, her artificial sweetness replaced by barely controlled anger, "this has gone far enough. We're prepared to make you a final offer." "I'm listening." Gerald pulled out a folder thick with documents. "The HOA is prepared to purchase your lake access rights for $200,000. That's more than generous for what amounts to recreational water access." I almost laughed. $200,000 for water rights that controlled a 2-mile lake, plus mineral rights that could be worth millions, plus the legal right to shut down their entire development. "Thanks, but I'm not interested." Patricia stepped forward and the scowl deepened. "Mr. Chen, you need to understand something. We represent 53 families who invested their life savings in these homes. These people have children, mortgages, futures tied up in this property. You can't just destroy their lives over a grudge." "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm protecting my family's property rights." "Your family's been dead for years," Karen snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. "This is just you being selfish and vindictive." That's when I lost my temper. "My family's been dead for years?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Lady, my father died on that dock out there. His ashes are scattered in water that your people are now treating like a public swimming pool. Your residents are having beer parties on ground where 4 generations of my family are buried. And you think I'm being selfish?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. You want to talk about the people who invested their life savings? Talk to Mountain Vista Holdings. They're the ones who sold you lakefront homes without lake access. They're the ones who committed fraud. I didn't sell you anything, I didn't promise you anything, and I don't owe you anything. After they left, I sat on my porch feeling drained, but also somehow cleansed. For months, I'd been fighting a defensive battle, trying to prove that I had the right to keep what was mine. But now, finally, I was beginning to understand that I wasn't the one who needed to be defending anything. Karen Hendricks and her HOA had built their entire community on a lie. And now that lie was about to cost them everything. The showdown came on a gray October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd received that first certified letter from Karen Hendricks. But instead of meeting in some sterile conference room, we were gathered in the Willow Creek Estates Community Center, a building that, as I'd recently learned, had been built partially on land that my family legally owned. The room was packed. All 53 homeowner families were there, along with their various lawyers, representatives from Mountain Vista Holdings, county officials, and a handful of local reporters who'd gotten wind of what was shaping up to be the biggest property dispute in county history. Karen Hendricks sat at a table near the front, surrounded by 3 attorneys in expensive suits. She was wearing her armor again, the perfect hair, the designer clothes, the practiced smile, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved restlessly across her papers. Sarah Mitchell and I took seats near the back. We weren't the ones who'd called this meeting. We were just there to watch Karen's legal house of cards collapse. The meeting was being moderated by Judge Patricia Walsh, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been handling property disputes in our county for over 20 years. She started by laying out the facts as they'd been presented by both sides. This case, Judge Walsh announced, involves competing claims over lake access rights, property boundaries, and water usage rights for the lake adjacent to Willow Creek Estate. The HOA claims they were granted access rights during the subdivision process. Mr. Chen claims exclusive ownership of the lake and associated water rights. Gerald, the nervous board member, stood up first. Your Honor, the residents of Willow Creek Estates purchased their homes in good faith, believing they would have access to lakefront recreation. Mountain Vista Holdings specifically marketed these properties as having lake access. If Mr. Chen is allowed to block that access, 53 families will see their property values collapse overnight. Judge Walsh nodded. I understand the homeowner's concerns. However, Mr. Chen's property rights predate the subdivision by several decades. The question isn't what the residents were promised, it's what legal rights they actually possess. That's when Karen stood up. Your Honor, we've done extensive research into the property records, and we believe there are serious questions about the legitimacy of Mr. Chen's claims. The boundaries have been disputed for years, and there are indications that some of his documents may have been altered or misrepresented. I felt Sarah tense beside me. Karen was essentially accusing us of fraud, a serious allegation that could backfire spectacularly if she couldn't prove it. Judge Walsh looked directly at Karen. Mrs. Hendricks, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support that claim? Karen's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Davidson, stood up. Your Honor, we believe Mr. Chen has been selectively presenting documents that support his position while withholding others that might show a different picture. We'd like to request a full forensic examination of all property records dating back to the original land purchase. Sarah Mitchell rose from her seat. Your Honor, we welcome that examination. In fact, we'd like to present additional evidence that we believe definitively resolves this dispute. Judge Walsh nodded. Proceed, Mrs. Mitchell. Sarah walked to the front of the room, carrying a banker's box full of documents. Your Honor, during our research, we discovered that Mr. Chen's grandfather made several property purchases and filings between 1962 and 1,981 that have never been properly examined in this dispute. She began laying out the documents on a table: the original cabin deed, the water rights filings, the mineral rights claims, the conservation easement, and the historical society registration. These documents show that the Chen family doesn't just own the ranch property adjacent to the lake. They own the lake itself, the lake bottom, all mineral rights associated with the lake, and they hold conservation protections that specifically prevent commercial development. Davidson interrupted. Your Honor, these documents are decades old and may not reflect current legal realities. Mr. Davidson, Judge Walsh said sharply, water rights and mineral rights don't expire due to age. If these documents are legitimate, they supersede any subsequent claims. Sarah continued, but there's more, Your Honor. Our research revealed that Mountain Vista Holdings never actually secured lake access rights before developing Willow Creek Estates. They sold lakefront properties without having legal authority to provide lake access. A murmur went through the room. Several homeowners turned to stare at the Mountain Vista representatives, who were suddenly looking very uncomfortable. Furthermore, Sarah said, we discovered that the fence erected by the HOA is actually built on land legally owned by the Chen family. According to the original survey markers, which we've had independently verified, the HOA has been trespassing on Mr. Chen's property for over a year. Karen shot to her feet. That's impossible. We had the boundaries professionally surveyed. Judge Walsh held up a hand for silence. Mrs. Hendricks, please sit down. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have verification of these boundary claims? Sarah nodded and pulled out another document. Yes, Your Honor. We had 3 independent surveyors confirm the original boundary markers. The fence is currently sitting approximately 50 yards inside the Chen property line. The room erupted. Homeowners were shouting at the Mountain Vista representatives. HOA board members were arguing with their lawyers. Judge Walsh had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order. Quiet, she commanded. We will proceed with this hearing in an orderly fashion. But Karen Hendricks was far from quiet. Her face was flushed red, and her carefully maintained composure had completely cracked. This is ridiculous, she shouted. One man cannot hold an entire community hostage. We have rights. We have children who play in that water. We have families who depend on those property values. Judge Walsh fixed Karen with a steady stare. Mrs. Hendricks, your resident's situation is unfortunate, but it doesn't override existing property rights. If Mountain Vista Holdings misrepresented what they were selling, that's an issue between you and them. Davidson tried one last gambit. Your Honor, even if Mr. Chen owns the lake, surely there must be some provision for reasonable public access. This is an unreasonable restriction on commerce and recreation. Sarah Mitchell smiled the expression of a lawyer who knows she's holding all the winning cards. Your Honor, Mr. Chen has never restricted reasonable access. Anyone is welcome to request permission to use the lake for recreation, but the HOA never asked permission. Instead, they attempted to simply take what they wanted through intimidation and legal harassment. Judge Walsh spent nearly an hour reviewing all the documents Sarah had presented. The room remained tense and mostly quiet, broken only by whispered conversations and the occasional shuffling of papers. Finally, she looked up. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mr. Chen holds legitimate and superior property rights to the lake, its shoreline, and associated water and mineral rights. The fence erected by the HOA is on Mr. Chen's property and must be removed immediately. Karen jumped up again. Your Honor, you can't. Mrs. Hendricks, I'm not finished. Judge Walsh's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions. Furthermore, I find that the HOA has engaged in harassment and trespassing. However, I also recognized that the residents of Willow Creek Estates purchased their properties in good faith. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of families who were just beginning to realize how badly they'd been deceived. Therefore, I'm ordering the following. First, the HOA will immediately cease all trespassing on Mr. Chen's property and remove the fence within 30 days. Second, Mr. Chen will grant reasonable recreational access to Willow Creek Estates residents, with terms and conditions to be negotiated between the parties. Third, I strongly recommend that the homeowners pursue legal action against Mountain Vista Holdings for fraudulent misrepresentation. The gavel came down with a sharp bang that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. But Karen Hendricks wasn't finished. As people began filing out, she marched over to where I was sitting. "This isn't over," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I will make your life hell. I will." "Mrs. Hendricks," Sarah interrupted quietly, "you should know that we've been recording this conversation. Any further threats against my client will result in additional legal action." Karen looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that dozens of people had witnessed her outburst. Her face went pale, and without another word, she turned and walked away. As I watched her leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: peace. The lake was still mine. My father's dock was still mine. The place where 4 generations of my family had found solace and strength would remain in our hands. But more than that, I'd learned something important about myself. I'd discovered that, when pushed to the wall, when everything I cared about was threatened, I had the strength.